President Trump has shown time and time again that he's obsessed with loyalty, from his reported request for a fealty pledge from former FBI Director James Comey to his declaration that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and his base would still stand by him. It seems Scott Pruitt recognized this and calculated that a steadfast commitment to the president and his agenda would let him weather any storm. The strategy worked shockingly well. The EPA administrators survived months of increasingly outlandish misconduct allegations, featuring props like a used Trump hotel mattress, fancy lotion, expensive fountain pens, and a $43,000 soundproof phone booth, because Trump only cared that environmental regulations were being torn up, and Pruitt took an adoring tone in their interactions, according to the Washington Post. But Pruitt miscalculated on 2 points. First, he concentrated solely on ingratiating himself to his boss and made no effort to inspire the same loyalty in his underlings. While Pruitt's corruption might have been the most colorful, Trump's cabinet officials have sparked many other ethics investigations. Some outrageous Trump remark would quickly sweep those stories out of the headlines, but disgruntled former Pruitt staffers made sure his misconduct remained a top focus for months. Chmielewski, Pruitt's former deputy chief of staff, was accused of leaking about Pruitt's travel habits in retaliation for his firing in early 2018. Chmielewski angrily denied it, but as the Daily Beast notes, he then went on the record with the media and congressional investigators, describing a litany of abuses. Just before Pruitt resigned, Chmielewski and another former Pruitt aide, senior scheduler Madeline Morris, went on the record with the New York Times, saying she was fired for questioning the practice of retroactively deleting meetings from Pruitt's official calendar, which she believed was illegal. After Hupp told congressional investigators that Pruitt tasked her with tracking down a used Trump hotel mattress, she resigned. Then, according to the Daily Beast, Pruitt tried to ruin her career. The animosity toward Pruitt wasn't limited to a few former aides. The Hill reported that he created a work environment where young aides were pitted against each other. He expected employees to do whatever he wanted, and he rarely acknowledged their efforts. That's the difference between Pruitt and Trump. Rewards loyalty, but Pruitt couldn't care less, said a former senior staffer said. That's actually a common misconception, and it's Pruitt's second mistake. Trump once declared, "I value loyalty above everything else." And it can seem like he's bizarrely devoted to his top aides, for instance, keeping his campaign manager Corey Lewandowski on staff even as he faced a battery charge for grabbing a female reporter. But if Trump decides someone is a liability, he'll drop them in an instant. Michael Cohen has made it abundantly clear that he doesn't want to flip on his beloved boss, but the president isn't sticking his neck out to save his scandal-plagued fixer from federal prosecutors. Trump reportedly turned his back on his friend and mentor Roy Cohn when he found out he had aides, prompting the notorious attorney to remark, "Donald pisses ice water." It seems Pruitt's dismissal followed a similar pattern. He spent the 4th of July happily mingling at 2 Trump administration parties, giving no indication that he thought anything was amiss. Despite their chummy relationship, the next day Trump tasked someone else with firing Pruitt. The Post reports Trump described a much different, more flattering scene, telling reporters that the EPA chief came to me and said, "I have such great confidence in the administration. I don't want to be a distraction." Trump said there was no final straw that led to Pruitt's exit, and several reports suggest it was accumulation of negative press that did him in. But the New York Times said Trump found one recent story particularly embarrassing, a report that Pruitt had asked Trump to fire Jeff Sessions and make him Attorney General. Then the story about Pruitt's potentially criminal schedule changes raised new concerns in the White House that he was too much of a liability. By now everyone should be aware that the only person Trump is really loyal to is himself. However, some fervent Trump supporters can be quite naive, like GOP donor Doug Deason. "I am just so disappointed in the president's failure to support Scott against the angry attacks from the loony left," Deason told Politico. "Nothing he did amounted to anything big. He was the most effective cabinet member by far." Trump says EPA Chief Scott Pruitt resigned on his own. Everyone else seems to believe he was fired. President Trump said Thursday evening that there was no final straw that led embattled Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt to tender his resignation earlier in the afternoon, insisting that stepping down was very much up to him. "Look, Scott is a terrific guy. And he came to me and he said I have such great confidence in the administration. I don't want to be a distraction. And I think Scott felt that he was a distraction." Few others in Trump's orbit subscribed to that storyline. In fact, Trump had begun to grow tired of the torrent of negative news stories about Pruitt and had come to believe they were a distraction that wouldn't go away, Politico reports, citing an administration official. Pruitt, who believes he has a strong personal relationship with Trump, has told allies repeatedly in recent months that he wasn't worried about his job, insisting that the president had his back. In the end, The Washington Post adds, citing two administration officials, Trump forced Pruitt out Thursday without speaking to him, instead having his chief of staff call the Environmental Protection Agency around midday to say it was time for Pruitt to go. Trump has sounded increasingly exasperated with his EPA administrator's negative headlines, The New York Times reports, especially an embarrassing report this week that Pruitt directly lobbied him for Attorney General Jeff Sessions' job, and fresh allegations that Mr. Pruitt had retroactively altered his public schedule, potentially committing a federal crime, had also escalated concerns about him at the White House. Times reporter Maggie Haberman told CNN Thursday evening Pruitt was essentially fired by staff around the president. Watched her source's version of Pruitt's ouster below. Peter Weber.it's Friday, July 6, 2018. Here are some of the stories we're talking about on ABC News' new daily podcast. Start here. Point 1. Pruitt resigns. After months of growing ethics concerns and calls for him to step down, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt resigned Thursday, citing unprecedented and unrelenting attacks in a letter to President Donald Trump. The EPA chief had unfailing public support from the president amid questions about sweetheart deals on apartments, first-class flights, raises for key staffers and more. So what changed? ABC News chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl walks us through the timeline of events leading to Pruitt's resignation. Start Here is a daily ABC News podcast hosted by Brad Chmielewski featuring original reporting on stories that are driving the national conversation. Listen for free on the ABC News app, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play Music, iHeartRadio or Ask Alexa, play Start Here. Point 2. countdown to reunification. The Department of Health and Human Services announced Thursday it's now holding fewer than 3,000 immigrant children separated from their parents, including 100 children under 5 years old. Officials have been working to meet court-ordered deadlines for reunification, but it's still unclear how exactly the government will reunite families, according to ABC News' Geneva Sense, who covers immigration. 3. Poison plot widening. In the UK, there is finger-pointing and international intrigue after a couple suddenly collapsed following their apparent contact with a deadly nerve agent, the same used against a former Russian spy and his daughter back in March. ABC News' Eva Pilgrim spoke to a chemist who says this particular chemical is especially dangerous and can stand the test of time. 4. Trade war begins. At midnight last night, Trump followed through on his threat to tax billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The tariffs will largely affect Chinese tech companies, but what does the brewing trade war mean for the rest of us? Madeline, a market strategist at John Hancock Investments, helps us make sense of tariffs and how our wallets will be impacted.